The last thing Elowen Ashgrave heard before the palace gates slammed shut behind her was laughter. Not cruel laughter, not shouting, just laughter, soft, satisfied, the kind of laughter people make when a plan has worked exactly as they hoped. It came from the throne room, muffled by 20 feet of stone, and it followed her all the way down the frozen causeway where the guards stripped the sapphire pins from her hair and told her the empire's borders were now closed to her forever. 3 days earlier, she had been the future Empress of Vyrlia. She had planned the coronation menu. She had chosen the silk for her wedding veil. Then the Queen Mother collapsed at a banquet, foam at her lips, and every finger in that gilded room turned toward the one person who had poured her tea. No trial worth the name, no chance to speak. Just a crown prince who would not meet her eyes, a rival noblewoman who cried the loudest, and a verdict written before the ink on the accusation had even dried. They left her at the edge of the ashlands with nothing but the coat on her back, certain the wolves, or the winter, would finish what the court had started. They should have made certain she was dead. Because 3 years later, a woman rides back toward those same palace gates at the head of 4,000 soldiers who were exiled, erased, and forgotten exactly like she was. And this time, no one in that throne room is laughing. 3 days before the exile, the Grand Hall of Vyrlia smelled like beeswax candles and crushed violets. Elowen Ashgrave stood at the center of it in a gown the color of new snow, her hands folded, her spine straight the way her mother had taught her since she was 6 years old. A lady never lets her shoulders tell her fear. Across the room, Crown Prince Dariel would not look at her. That was the first wrong thing. In 11 months of courtship, Dariel had never once failed to find her eyes across a crowded room. He used to joke that he could feel her presence before he saw her, like warmth reaching a hand before it touched a fire. Tonight his gaze stayed fixed on the marble floor as if the answer to something terrible was written there. The second wrong thing was Lady Sarah Voss. Sarah stood beside the Queen Mother's empty chair, dressed in mourning gray, though the Queen Mother was, as far as Elowen understood, still breathing in the healer's wing down the hall. Sarah's eyes were red-rimmed and glistening, and when she looked at Elowen, something flickered behind the grief, something that did not belong there, something close to satisfaction. Lady Ashgrave. Duke Cassian Voss rose from his seat at the high table, his voice pitched to fill the hall without shouting, the voice of a man who had spent decades making accusations sound like simple observations. You poured Her Majesty's tea this evening. You selected the cup yourself from the kitchen tray. Is this true? It is true, Elowen said. As it was true every evening for the past month, I have poured Her Majesty's tea since the betrothal was announced. She trusted no one else to do it since her last lady's maid fell ill. How convenient, Cassian said, that on the one evening she nearly dies, it was your hand on the pot. A murmur rolled through the assembled nobles like wind through wheat. Elowen felt it before she understood it, the room turning degree by degree, the way a crowd turns when it has already decided the ending and only wants to watch it arrive. I did not poison her, Elowen said, and her voice did not shake, though everything beneath her ribs had turned to ice water. I have no reason to. In 4 months I would have been her daughter. Perhaps that is precisely the reason, Cassian said softly. A woman eager to become empress might grow impatient waiting for a natural transition of power. It was such an elegant lie that for one dizzying moment Elowen almost admired the architecture of it. He had not accused her of hating the Queen Mother. He had accused her of loving the throne too much, a motive so believable that every noble in the hall could picture themselves doing the same, and therefore believed absolutely that she had. Bring the physician, someone called, and the crowd parted for a thin man in gray robes who Elowen had never met in her life. He held up a small vial, its glass stained faintly green. Foxglove extract, the physician announced. Found in Her Majesty's private stores in a jar bearing the seal of House Ashgrave. Elowen's stomach dropped through the floor. She had never seen that vial before. She would swear it on her father's grave on the stars. On anything the court held sacred. And it would not matter because the seal on the jar was real. And the only people who could explain how her family's wax seal had come to rest on a poisoned bottle were not in this room, and one of them, she suspected, was standing 4 feet away from her, wearing borrowed grief like a costume. Dariel. She turned to him, and for the first time all evening he lifted his head. Look at me, you know me. You have known me since we were 12 years old, climbing the orchard wall at Ashgrave Hold. Do you truly believe I would do this? For one heartbeat, one single suspended heartbeat, she saw something crack behind his eyes. Doubt, recognition. The boy who used to steal peaches with her instead of the man being handed a verdict by his father's counsel. Then Duke Cassian's hand landed on his shoulder, and the crack sealed shut. The evidence is the evidence, Dariel said, and his voice came out flat, rehearsed, like a line memorized under duress. I cannot let personal feeling interfere with the law. There was no investigation, Elowen said, louder now, desperation finally breaking through the composure she had held since the accusation began. There were no witnesses called, no search of the kitchens, no questioning of the staff. You have decided I am guilty because a vial appeared and a seal matched, and you have not asked how a seal that has been locked in my father's study cabinet for 6 years found its way into the Queen Mother's chambers. Nobody answered her. That was the worst part, not that they disagreed, but that they simply declined to engage with the question at all, as though the truth had already stopped mattering the moment the accusation was made in front of enough witnesses. The Queen Mother, still recovering behind closed doors and unable to speak in Elowen's defense, would not wake for another 2 days, long after the sentence had already been carried out. Elowen would learn much later that this timing had not been an accident either. Elowen Ashgrave, Duke Cashin said, savoring each syllable, for the attempted poisoning of Her Majesty the Queen Mother, this council strips you of your betrothal, your title, and your place within the walls of the Empire. You are exiled beyond the eastern border to the region known as the Ashlands, effective at dawn. Exile, not imprisonment, not execution. Exile to a stretch of frozen, lawless land where the Empire sent its worst criminals to die slowly instead of quickly, so that no one would have to answer for the killing directly. This is a death sentence dressed up as mercy, Elowen said quietly, and for the first time that night Duke Cashin smiled just slightly, just enough that only she was close enough to see it. Then perhaps, he murmured, you should have thought of that before you got too close to a crown that was never going to be yours. She understood in that instant, looking at his small private smile, that this had never been about the Queen Mother's tea at all. It had been about something else entirely, something older, something that had been arranged long before tonight, with a patience that frightened her more than the sentence itself. She did not know yet what that something was, but she would learn, and when she did, she would make certain that every person standing in this hall tonight remembered her name for the rest of their lives, not as the poisoner they had condemned, but as the reckoning they had built with their own hands and sent walking alive out into the cold. The guards seized her arms. The last thing she saw as they dragged her from the hall was Lady Sarah Voss lowering her handkerchief just enough to hide a smile that had nothing to do with grief at all. The road to the Ashlands took 9 days, and the guards who escorted her spoke to her exactly twice. The first time was to tell her to walk faster. The second time was at the border marker itself, a black iron post half buried in frost, where the youngest of the 4 guards, a boy barely out of his training with a face that still held some capacity for shame, pressed a small wrapped bundle into her hands when his captain wasn't looking. "Flint and dried meat," he whispered. "It isn't much." "I don't believe what they're saying about you, my lady. Half the barracks don't." "Then why do it?" she asked, and she did not mean it cruelly. She meant it as a woman standing at the edge of the only life she had ever known, genuinely wanting to understand why anyone still believed in kindness. "Because orders aren't the same thing as truth," the boy said, and then his captain called his name and he was gone, marching back toward the wall that would never open for her again. She stood alone at the border marker until the sound of their horses faded into the wind. The Ashlands did not look like death at first. They looked like nothing, an endless gray plain broken by cracked stone formations, skeletal trees bent sideways by decades of wind, a horizon with no landmark to walk toward. The Empire called it the Ashlands because ash-colored dust coated everything, kicked up by storms that could bury a traveler within an hour if she was caught without shelter. Elowen had grown up reading books about strategy and history in her father's library. None of them had prepared her for how quickly the human body could betray the human will. By the 3rd day, her lips had cracked. By the 5th, her hands shook too badly to strike the flint properly, and she ate the dried meat raw and cold because she could not risk a fire in open ground where the wind would carry the smoke for miles and announce her position to anything hunting nearby. By the 7th day, she had stopped counting days and started simply counting steps because 100 steps was a goal small enough that her mind could still hold it. She thought more than once about lying down and not getting back up. It would have been so easy. The cold, past a certain point, stopped feeling like pain and started feeling like warmth, like sleep, like an invitation. What kept her walking was not hope. Hope had died somewhere around the 4th day, buried under exhaustion and betrayal. What kept her walking was smaller and colder and far more durable than hope. It was the memory of Duke Cashin's smile. You should have thought of that before you got too close to a crown that was never going to be yours. He had known something. He had planned something. And whatever it had required her specifically to be discredited, disgraced, and disappeared, not merely removed from the succession, but erased so thoroughly that no one would ever think to ask questions on her behalf again. That was not the behavior of a man protecting a queen mother from poison. That was the behavior of a man clearing an obstacle from a much longer game. She did not know the rules of that game yet. But she intended to live long enough to learn them, and then to make sure Duke Cassian Voss regretted every single move he had made against her. On the 9th day, a storm caught her in open ground with no rock formation nearby, and the world dissolved into gray, screaming wind that stripped the strength from her legs one stride at a time. She remembered falling. She remembered the strange, distant realization that the ground felt warm now, which every survival lesson she had ever read told her was the most dangerous sign of all. She remembered a shape moving through the storm toward her, tall, wrapped in furs, moving with the unhurried confidence of something that had crossed this exact stretch of wasteland 1,000 times before. She remembered a voice rough and low cutting through the wind. Another one, third this season. Get her up before the ground takes her. And then nothing at all. When Elowen opened her eyes again, she was lying on a bedroll inside a low stone shelter half dug into a hillside, a fire crackling somewhere nearby. And a woman with a scarred jaw and silver-streaked hair was watching her with an expression that was not quite kindness and not quite suspicion, something more careful than either. "You're awake," the woman said. "Good. That means you get to explain to me why the Empire threw away a noblewoman like garbage, and whether you're worth the food we just spent keeping you alive." Elowen tried to sit up and failed, her body still weak from 9 days of starvation and cold. But her voice, when it came, was steadier than she expected. "My name is Elowen Ashgrave," she said. "I was accused of poisoning the Queen Mother of Vyrlia. I did not do it. And I intend to go back one day and prove exactly who did, if I have to build an army with my bare hands to do it." The woman studied her for a long moment. Then unexpectedly she laughed, a short, dry bark of a sound that held more respect in it than mockery. "An army," she repeated. "With what, girl? You can barely stand." "Then teach me to stand," Elowen said. "I have nothing left to lose." "That should make me the easiest student you've ever had." Something shifted behind the woman's scarred, weathered face, recognition, maybe, of a fire she remembered lighting in herself once, a very long time ago. "My name is Bryn," the woman said at last. "Former captain of the 3rd Legion, exiled here 9 years ago for refusing an order I still don't regret refusing. You're in what's left of a camp full of people the Empire threw away exactly like they threw away you." She nodded toward the low murmur of voices beyond the shelter wall, dozens of them, Elowen realized, an entire hidden settlement she hadn't known existed. "We don't get many nobles out here. Most of them don't survive long enough to matter. Let's see if you're different." Elowen closed her eyes, exhaustion pulling at her like a tide, and for the first time since the trial, something that was not quite hope, but was close enough to it to matter, settled quietly in her chest. The camp Bryn led her into over the following days was nothing like Elowen had imagined when she pictured exiles. She had expected desperate scavengers, criminals, the broken remnants of people with nothing left to organize around. What she found instead was something closer to a hidden fortress of the discarded, nearly 300 souls living inside a network of caves and half-buried stone halls that predated the Empire itself. Ruins from a civilization no history book she had ever read even named. They called themselves the Forgotten Legion, and nearly every one of them had a story that rhymed with her own. There was Tomas, once a captain in the Royal Cavalry, exiled for refusing to burn a border village accused of harboring rebels who turned out, later and too late, to be innocent farmers. There was Elira, a healer stripped of her guild license and exiled for treating wounded soldiers on the wrong side of a border dispute the nobility had engineered for trade advantage. There was old Denric, who had once been the Empire's finest siege engineer, thrown out for daring to tell a general that his battle plan would get 400 men killed for nothing, and being proven right. Each of them had been punished not for wrongdoing, but for being inconvenient to someone with more power. "The Empire doesn't exile criminals," Bryn told her one evening, sharpening a blade by the fire while Elowen forced down a bowl of thin stew, her strength slowly returning day by day. "Criminals get executed, it's cheaper, and it makes a better public spectacle. Exile is what happens to people who are inconvenient, people who know something, people who refuse an order from someone powerful, people who threaten a plan already in motion." She looked up, meeting Elowen's eyes across the flames. "Which one were you, girl?" Elowen thought of Duke Cassian's smile, a crown that was never going to be yours. "I think," she said slowly, working through it out loud for the first time, "I was in someone's way. I just don't yet understand whose way or toward what. Then that's your first lesson, Bryn said. Out here, we don't waste time on grief, we spend it on understanding. You want revenge, you don't get it by charging back through that gate with a sword and a grudge. You get it by learning exactly what game is being played, and becoming better at it than the people who think they've already won. The next 3 months reshaped Elowen more thoroughly than the preceding 20 years had. Bryn trained her in the sword, not the elegant fencing taught to noble daughters for exhibition, but the brutal, efficient close combat of soldiers who expected to actually use it. Tomas taught her formation tactics, how to read a battlefield the way she had once read court intrigue, searching for the gaps an enemy didn't know they'd left exposed. Old Denrick, delighted to finally have a student who asked genuinely curious questions instead of demanding easy answers, taught her siegecraft, engineering, the mathematics of walls, and the patience required to bring them down without wasting a single soldier's life doing it. And Elira, in the quiet hours between lessons, taught her something else entirely: the layout of every noble house's private staff quarters, the rumor networks that ran beneath the empire's polished surface like water beneath ice, which servants could be trusted, and which lords could be bought. Because Elira had once treated half the palace staff for injuries the palace itself pretended didn't happen. Revenge built on rage burns out in one night, Elira told her once, tending a training wound on Elowen's forearm with practiced hands. Revenge built on patience can last long enough to actually finish the job. You want to survive going back there. Stop thinking like a wronged noblewoman. Start thinking like the people who wronged you. Learn to see the board the way they see it. Elowen took that lesson and did not let go of it for the rest of her life. By the 4th month, whispers began traveling into the camp, with the traders who occasionally risked the border crossing for salt and grain. Whispers that fit into the puzzle Elowen had been quietly assembling since the night of her trial. Duke Cassian Voss's house had been buying up failing merchant contracts along the eastern trade routes at an unusual pace over the past 2 years. His daughter, Lady Sarah, had been unofficially but very publicly attached to Crown Prince Dariel within 6 weeks of Elowen's exile. A courtship timeline that would have taken most noble families a full year to arrange through proper channels accelerated, as though someone had already written the ending before the story began. And the physician who had produced the poison vial at her trial, the thin man in gray robes she had never met, had, according to camp gossip carried by a trader who'd once served in the palace kitchens, been quietly installed in his royal position only 4 months before her trial on the personal recommendation of House Voss. It was not proof, not yet, but it was a shape, and the shape had a name written all through it. He didn't just want me gone, Elowen said quietly to Bryn one night, staring into the fire with the particular stillness of someone whose grief has finally hardened into strategy. He wanted the throne connected to his own bloodline, and I was the only obstacle standing in the way of Sarah becoming empress instead. The poisoning wasn't really about the queen mother at all. It was never meant to kill her, just weak enough to make me look guilty, strong enough to make the accusation believable, and timed precisely so she couldn't wake up in time to defend me before the sentence was already carried out. Bryn was quiet for a long moment, watching her with something that had shifted somewhere in these 4 months from careful evaluation into something closer to genuine respect. "You've stopped sounding like a victim," Bryn said finally. "You're starting to sound like a commander." "I want to be one," Elowen said. "Not to burn the palace down. Burning things is easy, any fool with a torch can do that, and it proves nothing except that you were angry. I want to walk back through those gates and dismantle everything Cassian Voss built, piece by piece, in front of every noble who watched him do this to me and said nothing. I want the truth laid so completely bare that no one in that hall will ever be able to look away from it again. That," Bryn said, a rare smile cutting through her weathered face, "is going to take more than the 300 people in this camp." "Then we find more," Elowen said. "How many other camps like this one exist in the Ashlands? How many other people did the Empire throw away for being inconvenient?" Bryn's smile widened into something almost fierce. "Girl," she said, "you have absolutely no idea how many." It took 8 months to visit them all. The Ashlands, Elowen learned, was not one wasteland, but a scattered archipelago of hidden survival. Nearly a dozen camps spread across the frozen expanse, none of them larger than a few hundred people, none of them aware the others existed. Each one convinced it was the only pocket of the forgotten left alive in the world. Bryn had known of 3 others through old contacts. Finding the rest took Denrick's maps, Elira's network of trader gossip, and Elowen's own dogged refusal to accept impossible as an answer to anything anymore. She rode into each camp not as a noblewoman seeking charity, but as someone with a plan, and that distinction mattered more than she expected. The Iron Hollow Camp 800 strong had been founded by a former general named Kestrick Vale. Exiled 11 years ago for a border dispute, the Crown had later quietly privately admitted he'd been right about. An admission that came with no reinstatement, no apology, nothing but a bitter footnote in a report no one outside the palace would ever read. When Elowen explained who had orchestrated her own exile, Kestrick went very still. Voss, he said, testing the name like a blade for flaws. Cassian Voss sat on the council that exiled me too. I always wondered why a border dispute needed a duke's opinion at all. He's been clearing a path, Elowen said. For years, it sounds like, anyone who could complicate his family's rise quietly removed one inconvenient truth at a time. Kestrick's jaw tightened. How many of us are there now all told across every camp? Counting Iron Hollow, Elowen said, just over 4,000. The old general looked at her for a long moment, this young woman who 8 months ago had nearly died of exposure in open ground. Now sitting across from him, with maps of trade routes and palace staff rotations, memorized cold speaking about armies like she'd commanded them her whole life. 4,000 exiled soldiers, engineers, healers, and strategists, he said slowly, every one of us with a personal reason to want House Voss exposed for exactly what it is. He set down his cup. That's not a rescue mission you're building, girl, that's a war. No, Elowen said. A war is what happens when you march on a gate with soldiers and hope numbers are enough. I don't want a war. I want a reckoning, precise, undeniable, impossible to dismiss as the ravings of a bitter exile. I want to walk back into that throne room with proof so complete that every noble who watched Duke Voss condemn me will have no choice but to watch him fall in turn. She leaned forward. Numbers matter, but strategy matters more, and I intend to have both. It was during those 8 months of travel that Elowen first heard the name that would matter more than any other whispered carefully in the third camp she visited, a smaller settlement called Greyreach. Home to just under 200 exiles, led by a woman who had once served as chief accountant to House Voss itself before being exiled for improper conduct, that on closer questioning turned out to be nothing more than discovering irregularities in the Duke's trade ledgers, that she had made the mistake of reporting to the wrong person. Her name was Petra Fenn, and when Elowen sat across from her and explained everything, the trial, the vial, the timeline of Sarah's courtship, the physician installed 4 months before her exile, Petra's expression shifted from cautious interest to something colder and far more focused. I can give you numbers, Petra said quietly. Actual numbers, trade contracts, falsified shipping manifests. A pattern of debts quietly forgiven for nobles who voted the way House Voss needed them to vote on 3 separate council decisions over the past 6 years, including, I would bet everything I have left, the decision to exile you without a proper trial. She met Elowen's eyes. I kept copies. I was foolish enough to think someone in the capital would eventually want to see them. I've been carrying them in a locked case for 4 years, waiting for someone who could actually use them instead of getting themselves killed trying. Elowen felt something settle into place inside her chest, not triumph exactly, not yet, but the specific quiet certainty of a puzzle finally finding its missing corner piece. I can use them, she said. Then you understand, Petra said, that this was never really about you specifically. You were simply the most convenient obstacle standing between House Voss and a throne they've been maneuvering toward for the better part of a decade. Lady Sarah wasn't meant to fall in love with the crown prince. She was placed in his path the moment it became clear you were becoming genuinely popular with the merchant classes, popular enough that a marriage between you and Prince Dariel might have actually threatened House Voss's grip on Eastern trade. They didn't exile me because they thought I was dangerous to the crown, Elowen said slowly, understanding arriving with the cold clarity of ice cracking underfoot. They exiled me because I was dangerous to them specifically. Yes, Petra said simply. By the time Elowen returned to the central camp, where Bryn Tomas, Elira, and Denric waited, she carried with her not just the loose loyalty of 4,000 scattered exiles, but the beginnings of an actual case. Documents, testimonies, a pattern of corruption stretching back nearly a decade. All of it pointing toward one family's calculated, patient climb, toward a throne that was never supposed to be theirs to reach. We're not ready yet, she told the assembled camp leaders that night, standing before a fire with the flickering light throwing long shadows across faces that had once belonged to generals, healers, engineers, and now belonged to something new entirely. Marching in with soldiers gets us slaughtered at the gate and gets every one of you branded traitors and rebels, exactly the story House Voss would want told. We need something they can't spin, can't dismiss, can't bury under another convenient accusation. Then what do we need? Kestrick asked. Elowen looked around the fire at the people who had taken in a dying, discarded noblewoman and rebuilt her into someone capable of standing here now, and felt the shape of a plan finally solidify into something with edges sharp enough to cut. "We need leverage," she said. "We start with trade. House Voss's power runs through the eastern routes, the same routes Petra's ledgers prove they've been manipulating for years. If we can disrupt that leverage quietly, expose it publicly, and do it in a way that makes the merchant houses and the smaller nobility turn against him on their own, we won't need an army marching through the front gate at all." She let the fire's light settle across the gathered faces. "We'll have the entire court doing our work for us, and when the moment comes to walk back through those gates, it won't be as exiles seeking mercy. It'll be as the people who finally exposed the truth," Bryn finished quietly, and around the fire, 4,000 forgotten soldiers, healers, and strategists began, for the first time in years, to believe they might actually get to go home. The first strike was not a battle. It was a bad harvest, or rather, the appearance of one. Denric and Petra spent 6 weeks mapping House Voss's eastern grain contracts, and what they found confirmed everything Petra had suspected. Duke Cashin had spent years quietly buying controlling shares in the granaries along the border route, using intermediary merchants so the ownership never traced directly back to his name. When the harvest came in, each autumn House Voss granaries paid farmers a fraction of fair value, then resold the grain at inflated prices to the smaller noble houses who had no alternative supplier. A slow, patient stranglehold that had made the Duke enormously wealthy while quietly bankrupting a dozen minor lords who now owed him favors, votes, and silence. "If we can offer those farmers a real market," Elowen said, spreading Denric's maps across the table, "one that pays fair value without running through a Voss-controlled granary, the Duke's grip breaks on its own. No accusations needed yet, just competition." It was Elira who found the opening. Through her old network of palace staff and trader contacts, she learned of a merchant guild in the free port city of Halston, technically outside Voss influence. Resentful of the Duke's expanding reach into territory they considered their own trading ground, and more than willing to fund an alternative grain route if it meant clipping House Voss's wings. Elowen went to Halston herself, though not as Elowen Ashgrave. She traveled under the name Elara Voss, no relation, a deliberate irony Petra had suggested with a thin, satisfied smile, a trade representative for a coalition of independent Eastern producers. Her face, weathered now by a year in the ashlands and framed by hair she'd cut shorter and darker than the golden waves the court remembered, drew no recognition at all. The girl who once poured tea for a queen mother was gone. In her place stood someone sharper, harder to read, impossible to place. The Halston Guild masters were skeptical at first. An unknown coalition offering better rates than an established Duke's granaries sounded, to seasoned merchants, exactly like a scam. It was Elowen's command of the actual numbers that changed their minds. Fair prices calculated to the copper transport logistics, mapped route by a former siege engineer who understood terrain better than any merchant in the room. And a guarantee backed by grain reserves. The Forgotten Legion had spent a year quietly stockpiling from farmers desperate enough to gamble on an unknown buyer over a known exploiter. "You've done this before," the guild master observed, studying her with new interest. "I've studied it obsessively," Elowen said, which was truer than he could have known. Within 4 months, farmers along 3 separate border districts had begun quietly diverting their harvest to the new coalition instead of Voss granaries. The Duke's profits didn't collapse, not yet, not dramatically enough to draw attention to its cause, but they thinned steadily month over month, in a way that any competent accountant would eventually notice. Cashin Voss was, unfortunately for Elowen's timeline, an extremely competent accountant. It was Tomas, running reconnaissance along the border under cover of a traveling blacksmith, who brought back the warning that changed everything. "The Duke sent inquiry agents into 3 districts asking about a new grain buyer," he reported, tense with urgency. "They're not subtle about it. Someone's going to talk eventually, a farmer who doesn't know better, a merchant who wants to curry favor. It's only a matter of time before your name reaches Voss's ears, even under an alias." "Then we move faster than his patience," Elowen said, though inwardly the walls of the trap she'd been so carefully building suddenly felt thinner than she'd hoped. The following week, an invitation arrived at the Halston Guildhall, addressed not to Elara Voss, but with chilling specificity to the woman managing the Eastern Grain Coalition. No name, no accusation. Just a request to attend a trade summit in the border city of Marrow, hosted, the invitation noted with careful neutrality, by representatives of House Voss. "It's a trap," Bryn said flatly when Elowen relayed the message back to camp. "Of course it's a trap," Elowen agreed. The question is whether it's a trap meant to expose me, or a trap meant to feel me out because he genuinely doesn't know yet who he's dealing with. If it's the second, walking away now confirms his suspicions and loses us a year of quiet progress. If it's the first, she paused, feeling the old fear rise and deliberately setting it aside, then I need to know exactly how much he already knows before he knows I know it. You want to walk into a room with the man who exiled you, Elira said slowly, and have a trade negotiation with him. I want to look Cashin Voss in the eye for the first time in over a year, Elowen said, and find out whether he still believes I'm dead. The camp fell quiet around the fire. It was Petra finally who spoke the thing everyone else was thinking. If he recognizes you, she said, there will be no exile this time, no trial. He'll simply make certain you disappear completely and no one will ever ask a question about it because officially you already did. Elowen looked around the circle of faces, the general, the healer, the accountant, the engineer, the soldier who had scraped her half-frozen off open ground 14 months ago, and felt, beneath the fear, something steadier take hold. Then I suppose, she said quietly, I had better make sure he doesn't recognize me at all. Marrow's trade hall was smaller than the Grand Hall of Virlia, but no less carefully staged, polished stone floors banners bearing House Voss's blackened gold sigil hung with deliberate prominence. A long table set for negotiation that positioned the Duke's chair a half-foot higher than the others, a subtle architecture of dominance Elowen recognized instantly, because she had grown up surrounded by exactly this kind of quiet theater. She wore her hair scraped back beneath a merchant's traveling cap. A plain wool coat cut nothing like the silks the court remembered her in, and a pair of spectacles Elira had procured that did nothing for her vision, but changed the entire shape of her face when the light hit them. Denrick had spent 2 weeks coaching her on posture. Noble spines held tension high and proud. Merchant spines carried weight low and forward, the difference between a woman who had never worked with her hands and one who negotiated for a living. Duke Cashin Voss looked exactly as she remembered him. Older perhaps, silver threading further through his dark hair, but the same patient, assessing eyes, the same small private smile that had haunted her for over a year. Ah, he said, rising as she entered, the mysterious coalition finally reveals a face. I confess I expected someone older. Youth is not a disqualification for competence, Your Grace, Elowen said, and was gratified to hear her voice come out flat businesslike, nothing at all like the woman who had once pleaded with a court to believe her innocence. Though I understand the confusion. Not many young women manage a grain coalition that's cost House Voss granaries a meaningful percentage of their eastern margins in under a year. Something flickered behind Cashin's eyes, surprise, she thought, that she'd stated the numbers so directly, forcing the conversation past its polite opening pleasantries. Direct, he said, I appreciate that in a negotiation. Very well, let us be direct. My granaries have operated those routes for 11 years. Your coalition appeared, as far as my agents can determine, from nowhere roughly 14 months ago, with financing that no one in Halston seems entirely able to explain. I find that curious. 14 months is precisely how long it takes to properly organize independent farmers who have spent a decade being underpaid by a granary system with no competition to keep it honest, Elowen said. You'll forgive me if I don't find the timeline as mysterious as you do, Your Grace. Some of us simply saw an opportunity your granaries left wide open through their own greed. For a long moment, Cashin studied her, not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular intensity of a man accustomed to reading people for weaknesses, searching her face for something he couldn't quite name. Elowen made herself hold his gaze, made herself breathe evenly. Made herself remember every lesson Bryn had drilled into her about controlling a body under pressure. Because if there was one thing she had learned in the Ashlands, it was that fear had a scent, and predators like Cashin Voss had spent their whole lives learning to smell it. You remind me, he said slowly, of someone. Her pulse spiked. She kept her face perfectly still. I'm told I have one of those faces, Your Grace, she said lightly. Shall we discuss terms, or would you prefer to continue speculating about my resemblance to people you've known? Something in her tone, the faint edge of impatience, the refusal to be rattled, seemed to settle whatever suspicion had been forming behind his eyes, and he sat back, gesturing for her to take a seat at the table. Terms, then, he said. I am prepared to offer your coalition a buyout, generous by any reasonable measure. Enough that every farmer currently selling to you could retire comfortably, and enough that you personally would never need to work again. And in exchange, Elowen said, the grain routes return to House Voss's exclusive control, prices rise back to whatever margin suits Your Grace's preferences, and every farmer who trusted us goes back to being quietly exploited by a granary system with no competition. In exchange, Cashin said, unbothered by her bluntness, Everyone involved becomes extremely wealthy and extremely safe. I find those two things tend to matter more to people than principle, in my experience. Principle is a luxury for those who have never truly needed money. An interesting philosophy from a man who inherited his fortune, Elowen said, and watched, with quiet satisfaction, a flicker of genuine annoyance cross his composed face for the first time. I built considerably more than I inherited, he said, an edge entering his voice now. I don't doubt it, Elowen said. I've studied your ledgers rather closely this past year, Your Grace. You built quite a lot, grain monopolies, forgiven debts that purchased council votes, a rather remarkable pattern of inconvenient people finding themselves exiled or discredited at precisely the moments they threatened to interfere with your ambitions. She let the silence stretch just long enough to be unmistakable. It's genuinely impressive work in its own way, the kind of patient architecture that takes a decade to build properly. The trade hall went very still. Cashin's expression did not change, not obviously, but something behind his eyes sharpened into focus, recalculating her, reassessing every assumption he'd walked into this room holding. That's a remarkably specific accusation, he said quietly, for a grain merchant to make. I'm full of surprises, Your Grace, Elowen said, rising from her chair before he could press further. Before the careful control she'd maintained for the past hour could crack under the weight of finally saying even a fraction of what she'd carried inside her for 14 months. I believe I'll decline your generous buyout. My farmers seem to prefer honest wages to comfortable silence. Do give my regards to Lady Sarah. I understand congratulations on her engagement are rather overdue. She was 3 steps toward the door when his voice stopped her, quiet and cold in a way that made the hair on her arms rise. Ashgrave, she did not turn around. She could not let him see her face in this moment, could not risk whatever expression might betray her if she met his eyes now. I'm sorry, she said, keeping her voice light, merchant flat, betraying nothing. I don't believe that's my name, Your Grace. No, Cashin said slowly, and she could hear the smile returning to his voice, cold and certain. I don't suppose it is, not officially. She walked out of that hall with her pulse hammering against her ribs and her hands steady at her sides. And she did not allow herself to run until she was 3 streets away around a corner, out of sight of anyone who might report which direction the mysterious grain merchant had gone. He knew. Or if he did not know with certainty, he suspected strongly enough that certainty was only a matter of time now. The quiet phase of the war was over. Elowen rode back to camp faster than she had ever ridden anything in her life. And the moment she relayed the exchange to Bryn, Petra, and the others, the mood around the fire shifted from cautious optimism into something closer to a war council. If he suspects, he'll move against the coalition first, Petra said, already working through the implications. He won't accuse you publicly, not without proof, and definitely not while there's any chance he's wrong about your identity, because accusing a dead exile of returning would raise far too many questions about how thoroughly the original trial was handled. He'll move quietly, financial pressure. Intimidation of the farmers, perhaps an accident or two made to look natural. Then we protect the coalition first, Elowen said, and we accelerate everything else. We no longer have the luxury of a slow, patient dismantling. We need allies inside the capital, nobles who already resent House Voss's growing influence, merchants tired of being squeezed, anyone with standing enough to ask uncomfortable questions in rooms we can't yet enter ourselves. It was Elira who suggested the name that would prove pivotal. Lady Muriel Corwin, an elderly, sharp-tongued noblewoman who had once been the Queen Mother's closest confidant before a falling out with House Voss over an unrelated trade dispute years earlier, had pushed her toward the political margins of court life. She was known for 2 things, an encyclopedic memory for court scandals spanning 4 decades, and an abiding, well-earned dislike of Duke Cashin Voss that predated Elowen's exile entirely. If anyone in that court still has both the will and the standing to ask hard questions, Elira said, it's her. Reaching Lady Corwin without alerting House Voss's considerable network of informants took another 2 months of careful groundwork. Coded letters passed through trusted intermediaries. A meeting finally arranged not in the capital, but at Corwin's country estate, 3 days' ride from prying eyes. Elowen traveled there herself, still under her merchant alias, though she suspected, the moment she was shown into Lady Corwin's private study, that the disguise would not last the conversation. The old woman studied her for a long, uncomfortable moment before speaking. You have your mother's eyes, Lady Corwin said finally, and Elowen felt the careful composure she'd maintained for over a year crack for the first time in front of a stranger. I knew Elowen Ashgrave before you were born, girl. I attended her wedding. I held you as an infant, though I doubt you remember that. Her sharp eyes narrowed. I also attended a trial 14 months ago that I have not been able to stop thinking about since, because nothing about it made a shred of sense to anyone who actually understood how poison, or courts, or Cashin Voss operate. Then you already suspect what I've spent the past year confirming, Elowen said quietly, and laid Petra's documents across the table between them. The falsified manifests, the forgiven debts, the timeline of Sarah's engagement, the physician's suspicious appointment 4 months before the trial. Lady Corwin read through every page, in silence, her expression darkening with each one. And when she finally looked up, there was something fierce and cold in her ancient eyes that Elowen recognized immediately. Because she had seen the same expression reflected in her own mirror more times than she could count over the past year. That poisoning was never meant to kill the Queen Mother, Lady Corwin said slowly. It was meant to discredit you specifically, at precisely the moment your popularity with the merchant classes was beginning to threaten House Voss's economic reach into the Eastern trade. Cashin didn't want a poisoning. He wanted a poisoning with your fingerprints on it. She set the documents down with deliberate care, as though handling something that might detonate. I have wanted this man's downfall for 11 years, child. I simply never had the proof to make it stick. You've handed me exactly what I've been missing. I don't want him quietly disgraced and pensioned off to some distant estate, Elowen said. I want it done publicly, undeniably, in front of every noble who watched him condemn me without a shred of real evidence. I want the Crown Prince himself to understand exactly what he was manipulated into doing, and I want Lady Sarah's engagement exposed for exactly what it always was. A calculated piece on a board she never actually chose to play, or perhaps chose all too willingly. Lady Corwin's mouth curved into something that was not quite a smile, sharper than that and far more dangerous. Then you'll need more than documents, she said. You'll need a moment, a stage. Something so public and so undeniable that even House Voss's considerable influence over the council cannot bury it before the truth has a chance to spread. She tapped one gnarled finger against the table, thinking, the autumn accord is in 6 weeks. Every noble house in the empire will be present, along with foreign trade delegations from 3 neighboring kingdoms. Cashin himself will be there. He chairs the Eastern Trade Committee this cycle, which means he'll be standing at the very podium where trade disputes are formally addressed and resolved. A trade dispute, Elowen said slowly, understanding beginning to take shape, exactly like the one my coalition has been quietly building against his granaries for over a year. If you bring your grievance to that podium formally, Lady Corwin said, as a legitimate trade complaint, backed by documented evidence in front of foreign delegations who have no loyalty to House Voss and every incentive to see a corrupt monopoly exposed, he cannot simply silence you the way he silenced you the first time. Not without confirming, in front of the entire empire and half its neighbors, exactly how far he's willing to go to protect a secret. Elowen felt something settle into place inside her chest, not quite peace, but the particular steady clarity of a plan finally acquiring its final necessary shape. 6 weeks, she said. 6 weeks, Lady Corwin agreed, to build a case so complete that even Cashin Voss's considerable talent for elegant lies cannot talk his way free of it. Elowen thought of Bryn's training, of Denrick's maps, of Petra's ledgers, of 4,000 forgotten soldiers scattered across a wasteland the Empire had assumed would swallow them all quietly. She thought of the boyguard who had pressed flint and dried meat into her hands at the border. Of the 9 days that should have killed her, of the small private smile Cashin Voss had worn while sentencing her to a death he'd assumed no one would ever have to answer for. 6 weeks is enough, she said. It will have to be. The next 6 weeks moved faster than any period of Elowen's life before them, and it was during the 4th week that House Voss finally stopped guessing and started acting. It began small, a fire at one of the coalition's grain stores near the border, ruled an accident by local authorities who, Petra confirmed within a day, had received a generous and suspiciously timed donation from an anonymous benefactor shortly before issuing their report. Then 2 of the Halston Guild masters who had backed the coalition's financing quietly withdrew their support, citing vague reconsiderations that neither would discuss in any detail, their sudden silence far louder than any explanation could have been. He's testing pressure points, Bryn said grimly, studying the pattern Petra had laid out, feeling for exactly how much force it takes before something breaks. It was the 5th week that the pressure stopped being subtle. Elowen was riding back from a final coordination meeting with Lady Corwin. Accompanied by only 2 of the Legion's soldiers as escort when the ambush came, 4 riders emerging from tree cover along a stretch of road Denrick had assured her, with safe blades already drawn, moving with the coordinated precision of trained mercenaries rather than common bandits. The fight that followed lasted less than 2 minutes, but it was the longest 2 minutes of Elowen's life. 14 months of Bryn's training took over before conscious thought could catch up. Her body remembering drills rehearsed 1,000 times over. Her blade finding gaps in an attacker's guard she wouldn't have been able to name to an observer, but that some deeper part of her recognized instantly. One of her escorts took a wound to the shoulder that would keep him abed for a month. 2 of the 4 attackers did not survive the encounter. The other 2 fled into the tree line the moment the fight turned decisively against them. It was the dying words of one of the attackers, gasping out his final breaths on the roadside, that confirmed everything Elowen had already suspected. "Voss," he managed, blood bubbling at his lips. "Paid well, told us noblewoman traveling under a false name, said to make it look like bandits." "Who gave the order?" Elowen demanded, kneeling beside him, some cold, distant part of her noting with clinical precision that she felt no guilt at all watching a man who tried to kill her die on a roadside. 14 months in the Ashlands had burned that particular softness out of her. Was it the Duke himself or someone acting on his behalf? But the man's eyes had already gone glassy, and whatever answer he might have given died with him. She rode back to camp in silence, her hands finally beginning to shake now that the immediate danger had passed. Adrenaline giving way to the slower, colder understanding of exactly how close she had come to dying for the second time because of Cassian Voss's ambitions. "This confirms he knows," Lady Corwin said grimly, when word reached her by coded letter 2 days later. "Or knows enough to consider you dangerous regardless of certainty. He's grown desperate enough to risk assassination rather than wait for the accord to play out through proper channels. That's not the behavior of a confident man, child. That's the behavior of a man who understands on some level that his position is far less secure than he'd like it to be." There was a second, quieter piece of news that arrived alongside the warning. Carried by one of Elira's old palace, contacts a kitchen maid who still worked within House Voss's household and had over the past months been carefully and cautiously turned into an unwitting source of information, simply, by Elira's patient tending of old friendships. Lady Sarah Voss, the maid reported, had been overheard weeping in her private chambers 3 nights running, and had asked more than once whether anyone truly knew what had happened to the Ashgrave girl after her exile, questions she asked quietly, fearfully, and never in front of her father. She might not have known the full truth, Elira said carefully, when she relayed the report to Elowen. It's possible she was placed in the prince's path exactly as Petra suspected, without ever being told what her father did to secure that placement. It's possible she spent the past 14 months wondering the same thing everyone else in that court was told not to ask. Elowen sat with that information for a long time, turning it over, testing it against the memory of Sarah's small, satisfied smile behind a mourning handkerchief on the night of the trial, a smile Elowen had never been able to fully explain to herself as pure innocence, but that now held up against the maid's report seemed to carry a different weight. Guilt, perhaps, rather than triumph. The particular strained smile of someone caught inside a plan larger than herself, unsure how to escape it without destroying everything and everyone around her, including the crown prince she may have, despite everything, actually come to care for. "It doesn't excuse what happened to me," Elowen said finally. "No," Elira agreed. "But it might mean there's one more person inside that palace who wants the truth exposed as badly as you do. She just hasn't found the courage yet to be the one who exposes it." Elowen thought of the autumn accord, now barely 2 weeks away. She thought of the assassins on the roadside, of the fire at the grain store, of Cassian Voss's growing desperation as his carefully built architecture of lies began finally to show its first genuine cracks. "Then perhaps," she said slowly, an idea beginning to take shape, dangerous and precise in equal measure, "it's time someone gave her that courage." The autumn accord opened beneath a sky the color of hammered steel, banners from 4 kingdoms snapping in the wind above the trade pavilion. And Elowen stood at the edge of the assembled crowd in a gown of deep charcoal silk. Noble again at last, though she wore the color deliberately a shade close enough to mourning that anyone who looked closely might wonder exactly what she was grieving. She had spent the previous evening in a quiet, carefully arranged meeting that Lady Corwin had made possible through channels so discreet that even Duke Cassian's considerable network of informants had for once failed to detect it. A private audience with Lady Sarah Voss. Arranged under the pretense of a dress fitting, conducted instead in a locked antechamber where Elowen had finally lowered the merchant's disguise and let Sarah see for the first time in 14 months the face of the woman she had watched condemned in that grand hall. Sarah had gone white, then wept, then, to Elowen's genuine surprise, apologized haltingly and completely, confirming everything Petra's ledgers had already suggested. She had not known about the poison. She had known only that her father wanted her positioned near the prince, and had assumed, with the particular willful blindness of someone raised inside a family built on careful lies, that Elowen's disgrace had been a simple matter of the prince's changing affections rather than a deliberate frame. "I have spent 14 months telling myself I didn't know," Sarah had said, tears cutting through her careful court composure. "But I think some part of me always knew and simply didn't want to look at it closely enough to be certain." "Then look now," Elowen had told her not unkindly, "and decide tomorrow which version of yourself you intend to be." Now standing in the crowd as the trade committee assembled at the central podium, Elowen watched Cassian Voss take his seat at the head of the Eastern delegation. Composed and commanding as ever, entirely unaware that the daughter seated 3 chairs to his left had spent the previous night deciding at last to stop being a piece on someone else's board. The formal proceedings began with routine matters, tariff adjustments, shipping disputes between minor houses, the ordinary business of empire. It was nearly 2 hours before the moderator called for any remaining grievances to be formally entered into record, and Elowen felt Lady Corwin's steady hand find her elbow. "Now," the old woman murmured, "or never." Elowen stepped forward into the open floor of the pavilion and felt the specific silence that falls over a crowd the instant it recognizes it is looking at something it does not yet understand but senses immediately will matter. "I bring a formal trade grievance," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the pavilion, steadier than she had believed it would be, against the Eastern granary monopoly operated under House Voss, regarding a documented pattern of falsified shipping manifests, artificially suppressed farmer wages, and council votes secured through selectively forgiven debt. Cassian rose immediately, composure cracking at its edges for the first time. "This is highly irregular. Who is this woman, and on what standing does she bring accusations against?" "On the standing of Elowen Ashgrave," she said, and pulled the merchant's cap fully away, letting her true face and her true name fall into that crowd like a blade dropped onto stone, formerly of House Ashgrave. "Exiled 14 months ago for a poisoning I did not commit, a poisoning I can now prove was orchestrated specifically to remove me as an obstacle to House Voss's ambitions." The pavilion erupted. Foreign delegates murmured urgently to their attendants. Nobles who had watched her trial 14 months ago stared, as though witnessing something risen directly from the grave. And at the center of it all, Crown Prince Dariel rose slowly from his seat at the royal dais, his face drained of all color, staring at her across the pavilion as though the ground beneath the entire court had just cracked open. "Impossible," Cassian said, but his voice had lost its earlier command, and Elowen watched with grim satisfaction real fear finally surface behind his carefully composed eyes. "The Ashgrave woman was exiled to the Ashlands. No one survives the Ashlands." "I did," Elowen said simply, "and I brought proof." Petra stepped forward from the crowd, unrolling the documented ledgers before the assembled trade committee, the falsified manifests, the forgiven debts tied precisely to council votes, the timeline connecting the physician's suspicious appointment to Elowen's trial 4 months later. Lady Corwin added her own testimony, decades of court memory lending weight and credibility no exile alone could have carried. And then in the moment that broke the pavilion's stunned silence into outright chaos, Lady Sarah Voss rose from her own seat, trembling but resolute, and confirmed in front of the entire assembled empire that her engagement to the crown prince had been arranged by her father in the exact window following Elowen's exile. A timeline that made the poisoning's true purpose undeniable to anyone still capable of counting months on their fingers. "Father," Sarah said, her voice cracking but carrying clearly across the stunned pavilion, "tell them the truth. Tell them what you did to her, or I will." Cassian Voss looked for the first time in Elowen's memory like a man who understood with sudden, total clarity that the architecture he had spent a decade building was collapsing beneath him in real time in front of every witness who mattered, with no version of events left available to him that did not end in ruin. He said nothing at all. And in a court built entirely on performance, his silence was the most damning confession anyone in that pavilion had ever witnessed. What followed was not a battle, though for a long moment Elowen had genuinely believed it might become one. Duke Cassian Voss's household guard moved toward the podium at his sharp, wordless gesture, hands already on their hilts, and it was only then that the pavilion's outer doors opened and Bryn stepped through them at the head of 200 soldiers of the Forgotten Legion. Arriving precisely on the timing Elowen had arranged with Lady Corwin weeks earlier, not as an invading force, but as a formal escort requested through entirely legal channels for a noblewoman returning to formally contest an exile she believed unjust. A request buried in enough procedural language that House Voss's informants had never flagged it as a threat, until it was already standing in the doorway. Banners lowered, weapons sheathed, discipline absolute. "I did not come to burn this court down," Elowen said, her voice cutting through the tension gripping the pavilion, loud enough to carry to every foreign delegate and every noble house watching. "I came to prove a truth that was buried 14 months ago beneath a vial that was never mine, and a trial that was never real. Every soldier standing behind me was discarded by this empire the same way I was, for being inconvenient, for knowing something they weren't supposed to know, for refusing an order that should never have been given. We did not come here for a war. We came here so that the truth could finally be heard in a room that once refused to hear it." Crown Prince Dariel, still pale, descended slowly from the royal dais, and for a long moment stood before her in silence, the entire pavilion holding its breath around them. "I let them take you," he said finally, quietly, the words clearly costing him something enormous. "I stood there and I let them take you, and some part of me knew even then that something was wrong, and I said nothing because it was easier than questioning my own father's counsel." He swallowed hard. "I don't expect forgiveness. I only need you to know that I understand now exactly what I allowed to happen. I don't need your guilt, Dariel," Elowen said, and found to her own quiet surprise that she meant it. 14 months of exile had burned away not just her fear but her old attachment to a boy who had once climbed orchard walls beside her. That version of her love had died somewhere in the ashlands, replaced by something harder and clearer. "I need this court to formally acknowledge what actually happened, reverse the sentence, and hold Duke Voss accountable for a crime he committed to protect his family's ambitions. That is all I have ever wanted. Not your throne, not your guilt, just the truth spoken where everyone can hear it." It was the foreign delegations ultimately who forced the council's hand, representatives from 3 kingdoms who had just witnessed in real time documented proof of a corruption scheme that had directly affected their own trade interests, and who made unmistakably clear that continuing formal relations with a council that refused to act on such evidence would carry serious diplomatic consequences. Faced with exposure that could no longer be contained, or spun the very council that had exiled Elowen 14 months earlier voted. This time with actual deliberation and actual evidence before them, to formally reverse her sentence, restore House Ashgrave's title and lands, and open a full inquiry into Duke Cassian Voss's decade of manipulated council votes, falsified evidence. And pending further investigation, the attempted assassination along the border road 5 weeks prior. Cassian Voss did not go to the executioner's block. Elowen had not wanted that and had said so plainly during the council's private deliberation, not from mercy exactly, but from a harder-won understanding that Brynn had taught her a year earlier in the Ashlands. Revenge built on rage burns out in one night. Revenge built on patience can last long enough to actually matter. A quick execution would have been simple, and would have let him escape into martyrdom, whispered about sympathetically by nobles who preferred not to examine his crimes too closely. Instead, stripped of his title, his lands seized and redistributed among the farmers his granaries had exploited for over a decade, and sentenced to the very exile he had once used so casually as a tool against his enemies. Cassian Voss was escorted to the eastern border by a small guard detail that included with a symmetry Elowen had specifically requested. The very same young soldier who had once pressed flint and dried meat into her hands and whispered that orders weren't the same thing as truth. Lady Sarah, whose testimony had proven pivotal in breaking her father's composure at the crucial moment, was neither punished nor rewarded, but simply, at her own quiet request, released from her engagement to the crown prince and permitted to withdraw from court life entirely to a small property in the countryside where the last Elowen heard. She had begun quietly funding a school for the children of farmers her father's granaries had once exploited, a small private penance no one had asked her to perform. As for the 4,000 exiles of the Forgotten Legion, the council's formal inquiry, pushed relentlessly by Lady Corwin, who seemed to have found in her final years an entirely new appetite for dismantling old injustices, eventually confirmed what Elowen had always known in her bones, that the vast majority of them, like her, had been exiled not for genuine crimes but for the crime of being inconvenient to someone with more power than conscience. Full pardons were issued, lands were restored where possible. Kestrick Vale was reinstated to the rank the Empire had stripped from him 11 years earlier, and Denric was given, at long last, the position as Royal Chief Engineer that his talent had always deserved and his honesty had always cost him. Elowen stood at the edge of the Grand Hall 6 months later in the same room where she had once been condemned, watching 4,000 soldiers who had been thrown away and forgotten march in formal procession to receive the Empire's long-overdue acknowledgement of the wrong done to them, and found to her quiet surprise that the triumph she felt was not loud or vicious. Not the vindictive satisfaction she had once imagined tasting on the long freezing nights in the Ashlands when survival had seemed impossible. It was quieter than that, steadier, the particular hard-won piece of a wound that had finally fully closed. Bryn found her there, watching the procession, and bumped her shoulder gently against Elowen's in a gesture that had become, somewhere over the past year and a half, more eloquent between them than any formal words of gratitude could have been. "Commander," Bryn said, using the title the Legion had given her months ago, half in jest at first and then gradually in complete earnest, "does it feel the way you thought it would?" Elowen considered the question honestly. Watching the light from the tall windows fall across the faces of soldiers who had once been strangers to her dying in a wasteland the Empire had assumed would erase them quietly, and who had instead built together out of nothing but patience and shared injustice. The very force that finally forced the truth into the light. "No," she said finally, and found herself, for the first time in over a year, smiling without any bitterness at all. "It feels better, because this was never really mine to win alone. It never should have been." The Empire that had once thrown her away like something disposable would spend the coming years learning, slowly and thoroughly, the price of forgetting that the people it discards do not simply disappear. Sometimes given enough patience, enough purpose, and enough people who refuse to let injustice go unanswered. The forgotten come back, not with fire and slaughter, but with truth sharp enough to cut through every lie that was ever built to bury them. And they come back changed into exactly the thing their enemies should have feared creating in the first place.